Alright guys, this is the video for 10.6. So in 10.6 we're talking about how to use the quadratic formula. Okay? Now this is honestly my personal favorite because you can use any type of quadratic with this. It's awesome. So we've talked about factoring, we've talked about graphing, we talked about completing the square. Those are all methods you want to use. Completing the square you can use when it's not easy to factor, but this one is you can use absolutely anything with. So what it is, this is going to be important for you guys to write down, okay? The quadratic formula, x equals, and we have negative b, make sure I have this right for you. Yep, negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now this looks complicated, but it's really not. All we're going to be doing is inserting values in for these, okay? And what we are using here is our traditional quadratic equation, okay? Where I have something like this, a squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Okay, so all I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be plugging values in from my original equation, okay? And then I'm just going to plug and chug and I'm going to solve for x. This is going to give me all of my solutions to any quadratic equation. Okay, so let's do an example where we're using this. Alright, so if I want to solve this equation, x squared plus 6 equals 5x. Okay, so I always want to start with my equation in standard form. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0, so that I know exactly what my a term, b term, and c term are. If they're not in standard form, I'm going to be doing the equation incorrectly. Okay, so I want to subtract 5x. We always do need it to be equal to 0 to be able to solve, so I'm going to subtract 5x from both sides. So I'm going to rewrite this as x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. And I rewrote it with my negative 5x first here before the 6 so that it is in standard form. Okay, so now I'm just going to use this formula to solve for x. Okay, so I'm just going to plug in my b here, a here, c here, and a here. So I like to go through and just determine what are my a, b, and c for my equation. Okay? So a in this case is 1. There's no term in front of x. My b here is negative 5. And my c is 6. So all I'm going to do now is I'm going to replace those letters with my values that I just determined. Okay? So when I do that, I have x equals, okay, negative b. b is negative 5, so a negative of a negative, we'll make that a positive 5, plus or minus the square root, b squared, so this is negative 5 squared, minus 4 times a times c. a is 1, and c is 6, okay? All over 2 times a, which would be 2 times 1. Now I'm just going to go through and simplify everything. It's very important that before we take the square roots that I do simplify as much as possible what is underneath. Okay? So as I'm doing that, plus or minus, okay, so simplifying inside here, negative 5 times negative 5, that would give me 25. And then I have 4 times 1 times 6, which would give me 24. All over 2 times 1, which is 2. This here simplifies to 1. Square root of 1 is 1. So I end up with x equals 5 plus or minus 1 all over 2. So again, I'm going to come up with two solutions. I'm essentially solving two equations simultaneously. I'm doing this, x equals 5 plus 1 over 2, or 5 minus 1 over 2. Okay, so as I do that, 5 plus 1 is 6, divided by 2 would give me 3. 5 minus 1 is 4, divided by 2 would give me 2. So I have x equals 3 or 2 would be my solutions. Okay, now this one we probably could have factored without using this, but this comes so much in handy when we have something other than 1 for a, and that we don't get integers to factor. So in some of your homework you're going to be asked to approximate, and you'll definitely want to use a calculator to determine this, and you'll end up rounding to the nearest hundredths place. Okay, last thing I want to talk about in this video, and this will be good for your notes page, okay? So I want to talk about our different methods that we've discussed in chapter 10. They all deal with solving quadratic equations. Okay, so the first method we've talked about is graphing. Now, graphing comes in handy because it's good to understand what a quadratic function looks like. But realistically, if you're solving a quadratic function, this is only simple when you have a graphing calculator because it is tedious, as you guys know. So graphing we'll probably use only when we have a graphing calculator on hand. Okay, that's when we would want to use that method. Our next method we learned was square roots. We used this when we had no b term, when we had something like this, x squared plus c equals 0. Or we could take the square root of both of those, okay, or minus c, either way. So when there was no b term, that's when we used the square root method, okay? Now, the factoring. So factoring, that's where we use the zero product rule, where we solved each factor for 0, set it equal to 0. We only use this when it's easy to factor, because zero product rule is awesome and easy to use, but if our function is not easy to factor, that method's not great. So only when it's easy to factor do we use this method. Completing the square. We use the completing the square method when it's not easy to factor, but when we have a equal to 1. That's when it's going to be easiest, because if we don't, we have to divide everything by whatever a is. So when a is equal to 1, but the rest is difficult to factor, completing the square is really great. And then lastly, the quadratic formula that we just learned. You can use this at any time, but when you pretty much have to use it is when this is difficult to factor, especially when a is not 1, or when you can't factor it at all, because then we can use approximations and decimals to help us out. Okay? So those are all the methods we've learned. We will review all of those, you guys, after the SBAC, and then we'll have a test over Chapter 10, making sure that we understand and can do each of those methods.